This morning, we are going back to elementary school. Excited for that? Here's a little pop quiz for you. We'll see how you do. Red plus blue equals... Somebody failed already over here. I think it was Mike. Purple. Mike, try it again on this one. Yellow plus blue equals... There we go. Good. Red plus yellow equals orange. Congratulations. Most of you, except for Michael, passed. Mike, you have to go to the principal's office. This morning and next week, we're going to talk about orange. And you think, well, what in the world does that have to do with anything biblical or scriptural? Well, we're going to find out. There has been, over the last several months, some talk throughout our church here about this orange thing that is going on in our children's and youth ministry. And there's been a lot of talk about what this is, or what is this going to do, or what is it going to change. And so we want to take just a couple weeks and talk about what is orange, and so that we all kind of know what is being talked about. Back in April of this year, and then 2 years ago in April, a group of us went to Atlanta, Georgia for a conference called the Orange Conference. And this conference was basically a week-long set of sessions and breakout sessions, all geared towards family ministry. And so anything related to family ministry was talked about. So children's ministry, youth ministry, parenting ministries, marriage ministries, men's ministries, women's ministries, anything that relatively affects the family at all, and specifically really kids, was talked about at this conference. And really, it teaches how churches can take on this orange philosophy, which we're going to talk about the next couple weeks, and implement this in your church. And so for the next 2 weeks, we just want to kind of get the word out there. This is what orange is about. Now that we're kind of in, hopefully, a normal mode after summer, after the busyness of summer, I want to talk us through orange a little bit for the next couple weeks. Now, understand, there is no deep theological, scriptural meaning or backing for orange, other than it's the combination of the two colors. There is no Greek word that they suddenly realized equals orange that they found in the New Testament. There is none of that. But it is decades of people who have worked in churches that came together, put their heads together, and discovered some things that help us better equip our children to follow Jesus in their lives. And so that's what orange is all about. And it boils down to the color orange. And so as most of us passed the quiz this morning, the orange gets its name from combining the red and the yellow. And there is some backing for this. And so we're going to work our way through this. For our purposes this morning, red is going to represent the family. Red is going to represent the family, my family, your family, all of our families, the heart, the lifeblood that connects the family together. And this is really the family nurturing kids' hearts towards God. This is family showing the character and the nature of God to their kids. The primary responsibility of passing on faith to the next generation is the families. And so this is represented by the color red. God instituted the family thousands and thousands of years ago. And so red represents the family. Yellow represents the church. This is the light of the world, the light shining on a hill. The purpose of the church is to shine the glory of God to everyone, every generation, to shine like stars, as Paul said. The purpose of the church, the capital C church, across the world, is to shine the light of Christ in the darkness. God instituted the church thousands of years after the family. So we think about it. In the book of Acts, when the church really was instituted and took off, the church it began spreading, and there were families that were taking on the role of passing on faith to the next generation, but they had been doing this for thousands and thousands of years before. There was nothing else before the church. There was no institution to pass on faith to your kids before Acts. It was simply the job of the family to pass on faith. Now, looking at these two institutions we have, the family and the church, some of the goals should be the same between these two institutions, right? And one of them should be that we want our kids and our grandkids and our great-grandkids and so on to develop a faith, a relationship with Jesus that carries on into their adulthood. This should be one of the common goals. But if we look at it historically over the last 50, 70 years, have we been successful in that? I would maybe propose that at least at some level we've failed, the church and the family. If you look at studies, numerous studies will say that nearly 70% of teenagers that grow up in the church, that spend their lives going to church every week, and then they graduate from high school and they go off to college, 70% of those teenagers will walk away from the church and ultimately from God within the first year of college. 70%. And only one half of those that leave, one half of the 70%, are expected to come back to the church within the next 10 years. Just let that sink in for a moment. 70% of our kids that grow up in the church that we see every week, coming to Sunday schools, and maybe some of you have taught before, some of you have gone on trips with in youth group maybe, 70% of them statistically will walk away from the church within the first year of college. And only half of them are expected to return within the next 10 years. And most of the time, the ones that do return are only coming back because they realize the gravity of what it takes to raise kids and how maybe they don't have all the answers anymore. 70%, and then one half of that 70%. We're not necessarily doing a great job in leading our kids. And when I say we, understand, I mean the church, we are not doing a great job, but I also mean we as families. We're not doing a great job of leading our kids. And so the Orange philosophy and strategy is really all about getting the family and the church to work together for the betterment of our kids, to make stronger, better impact on families, specifically on kids. That's all Orange is about. It's about taking the two influences, the red of the family, the heart of the family, and the yellow of the church, combining them together and having a greater, more lasting impact on kids. You want to know where they got Orange? That's where they got it. And so combining these two different individual things, this is not necessarily an easy thing. We, as a country, as a society, maybe even politically, we're not necessarily knocking it out of the park when we talk about two different groups of people coming together to accomplish one goal. We say things like we want to cross the aisle politically in order for the betterment of the country, but we're not really knocking that out of the park, are we? And that same, I think, is true for when the family and the church come together as well. It's a difficult thing. It's awkward at times. It's much like, if you can remember that first dance that you had. Maybe you were in junior high, maybe you were in elementary. Remember your first dance that you ever had? I remember mine. I was a sixth grader. Our sixth grade classes would always have Halloween dances. Why Halloween? I don't know. It was just what they did. And so we would go to a barn and we would be surrounded by hay bales because we were in Baird, Nebraska, and that's what you did. And we would go out there and they had a little boombox in the corner and we would have a dance as sixth graders together. And I remember going out there in this barn and we're listening to music, but nobody is actually dancing. Because at that point in your lives, as sixth grade boys, girls still have cooties, and as sixth grade girls, boys are just annoying, right? So everybody's just kind of standing on the side of the area, and so Mr. Lutzenheiser, one of our teachers, he goes and he finds a broom in the corner of the barn, and he starts dancing with a broom, trying to kind of get us to start feeling a little bit more relaxed. And so what you have now is you have Mr. Lutzenheiser out in the middle of the dance floor making a fool of himself. And you have you have sixth grade boys standing on the side that really want to dance, but are very, very nervous to dance, right? They are stuttering, they are sweaty boys that are all kinds of nervous to go up and really have any kind of a conversation with a girl. And I, like every other nervous, sweaty boy, found a little bit of courage, followed by a lot of paralyzing fear, to walk up to the pretty girl and ask her to dance. And then you make your way out into the dance floor, and you don't know what to do. So you stand there awkwardly kind of looking at each other for a moment. You don't know where to put your hands, or you don't know how to move. You don't know, are you supposed to look at each other or stand beside each other? You don't know how to do anything, but awkwardly you kind of do something that resembles dancing with each other. Nervous, fear-stricken kids awkwardly swaying next to each other is about the best you got. Barely touching. But they are driven to dance with each other. The boys do really want to dance with the girls. The girls want to dance, and sometimes you have to dance with a boy in order to do that. But it's a magical thing that happens, isn't it? It's a milestone for so many kids, that first dance when you cross that border. And many of us can remember our first dance. Can remember who it was with, or where you were at, or what song was even playing. We were in a barn surrounded by hay bales. Her name was Maddie, and it was Savage Garden's Holy Deeply Truly. You remember these things sometimes. Orange is about getting the family and the church to dance with each other. Getting the family and the church to do something magical that takes both institutions to do it. We don't necessarily have all the answers. We don't necessarily have all the right moves. But the effort needs to be made for the church and the family to do something beautiful together like dance. And so the bottom line is this: two combined influences in a child's life makes a better impact than just one. Two combined influences in a child's life makes a greater, better impact than just one. The goal is to get these two influences, the church and the family, in a child's life to dance together. And so let's look at this biblically. Because one of the things that I love about Orange, it's got a solid, wide biblical foundation that we're going to talk about this week and next. And so let's unpack these two influences. And let's start with the church. The church's responsibility to be the light of the world. This should not surprise really anybody. Revelation chapter 1, verse 20 says this: "The secret of the 7 stars you saw in my right hand and the 7 gold lampstands is this. The 7 stars are the angels of the 7 churches, and the 7 lampstands are the 7 churches." The church is referred to throughout Scripture as a lampstand, as a light. In Exodus, in the Old Testament, when the tabernacle was being created, there was a room in the tabernacle called the Holies of Holies. It was covered and surrounded completely by curtains, and so it was completely dark. And there was, inside this Holy of Holies, there was 3 things. There was the showbread, the altar of incense, and there was the lampstand. And the lampstand was the only source of light inside this very dark room. John in Revelation is saying that the church is the lampstand. The church is what shines the light of God, what points to the glory of God in the dark world. In Acts chapter 2, as we start seeing the church begin to be formed and take off, the Christians are devoted to teaching and to breaking bread with one another, to fellowship, to prayer with one another. The first church grew and spread because they were a light in the darkness around them. And people were attracted to that light. And so we have to ask the question, I think, how has the church done in the last 2,000 years? It's true, the church has blown it a few times. We haven't knocked it out of the park all the time, but it has always continued. The church has always continued. Over the last 2,000 years, the church has always continued to pass on faith to the following generations, regardless of so many things that have tried to take it off course, so many persecutions that tried to take people out, so many false doctrines, so many people, individuals that were trying to derail the whole thing. the church still continues to live on and prosper today. And we take this responsibility of passing on faith to the next generation seriously. We have to take this seriously. The role of passing on faith to the next generation is important, and so for our part of this as the church, we have to be serious. There's a group of people that are down the hall right now, and some of them are in this room, that are dedicated on a weekly basis to passing on faith to the next generation. This is not childcare. This is not babysitting. This is not us just going down and playing for a little bit. This is serious devotion to cultivating a child's relationship with Jesus on a weekly basis. And so the church is doing what it can to shine the light of Christ in the dark world. There's another institution here as well, the family. The heart that connects us to our family. God instituted the family way before He instituted the church in order to impress upon children a faith in God, to show and act what it means to follow God. And so we can read passages like Deuteronomy chapter 6, when it says this, "Listen, Israel, the Lord our God, the Lord is one. Love the Lord your God with all your heart, with all your soul, and with all your strength. These words I am giving you today are to be on your heart. Repeat them to your children. Talk about them when you sit in your house and when you walk along the road, when you lie down and when you get up. Bind them as a sign on your hand and let them be a symbol on your forehead. Write them on the doorposts of your house and on your gates." Before the church was created or instituted, God designed for the family to pass on faith to the next generations by talking about it. As we're walking down the road, as we are making our way to different places, as we are sitting and eating meals together, as we are getting ready to lay down at night, and as we are getting up in the morning, we need to talk about it. We need to put up reminders around our house. We need to sometimes wear things to remind us about the goodness of God. The family is what was instituted first to pass on faith in God. Families should talk about and show kids how to live life of following God. It says this in Psalms chapter 78, starting in verse 4, "We must not hide them from our children. We must tell a future generation the praises of the Lord, His might, the wonderful works He has performed. He established a testimony in Jacob and set up a law in Israel, which He commanded our fathers to teach to their children, so that a future generation, children yet to be born, might know. They were to rise and tell their children, so that they might put their confidence in God and not forget God's works, but keep His commands." We are not to hide this from our children. The family is the place where faith is nurtured, where faith is passed on, so that they can pass it on to their kids, and so on. This has been the role of the family since the beginning of time. Let's look at it a different way, if we can. Let's imagine, just for a moment, that a bead like this represents 1 week. 1 week of time. Inside this jar has about 936 of these little beads. Parents, from the time your children are born until they graduate, you have about 936 weeks to make an impact on your kids. 936 weeks to point them towards Jesus, to cultivate a relationship with God. That's not a lot of time. 936 weeks. And I think it gets more serious for some of us. If you have a 9-year-old, you're halfway done. You have about 468 weeks left. 468 of probably the more difficult weeks of raising teenagers to point them and cultivate a relationship with Jesus. Let's just think about this for a moment. Time is so short and so precious with our kids. And so many times we focus on so many other things. Time is short until they grow up and they move out, theoretically. Now, let's look at it from the church's standpoint, and we have to change things a little bit because the church doesn't get to spend weeks with kids. We get hours, and so let's, for the church, pretend that this represents an hour. On a yearly basis, the church gets about 50 hours every week with kids. 50 hours, usually about once a week, to impress upon them a faith in Jesus, to point them towards Jesus. Now, that doesn't include times where families are not here. This doesn't include times where kids are sick or parents are sick or you take a family vacation or a sport is being played and so you skip church, or maybe dad just doesn't want to come to church because he's watching football, or you just don't want to come for whatever other reason. We get about 50 hours per week or per year with kids. It's not very much time. In fact, none of this is very much time, if we really think about it. And as a parent, this is somewhat terrifying for me, because I have a 6-year-old that's closer to this than she is to this. This should be a reality check for us as parents and as grandparents, as people who serve in the church. Parents, it is our responsibility alone to impress faith onto our kids. And I feel very inadequate in this. The Bible, scripturally, doesn't have great examples of parents, right? Maybe Mary and Joseph, maybe. But outside of that, there's not great examples of parents passing on faith to their kids. And then if you look outside of the Scripture, there's probably about 5 million parenting books out there that you're expected to somehow read as a parent. And they all have the key to parenting success, and you get very overwhelmed with the situation, with what is expected. But regardless of all that, as much as I want to just kind of duck out and say, you know what, cards are going to land as they do, it is still my responsibility as a parent to lead my kids. So Orange is about getting the family and the church, these two areas, to partner together, to pass on faith to the next generation. And many of you have probably seen in your lifetime, in your time in church, the rise of specialized ministry in the church. Back in the day, maybe 40, 50 years ago, the preacher kind of did most everything, right? He led children, he taught the youth, he led Bible studies, he preached, he did music, he did all of that. And then what we saw as a transition back starting in the 80s and 90s was that you would have people come and begin working in churches in just one specific area. It was the rise of specialized ministry. You would have people go to college just for youth ministry or children's ministry or now worship ministry or many other very specific areas of ministry in the church. The rise of specialized ministry. And along with this rise arose some bad or incorrect mindsets. With this, we kind of got the idea that the church substitutes for the family. We have somebody who went to college in order to do children's ministry, and they should be the ones that disciple our kids, right? The idea that started happening was that the church was more important than the family. The idea that it was okay for families to delegate responsibility and ultimately delegate discipleship of their kids to the church. And if you buy into this, understand, generally, let me just kind of say to you what happens. If you believe this and you have teenagers, you're delegating discipleship of your kids to generally a 22-year-old single guy who may or may not live in his mother's house still. Just saying. And when it doesn't work, we get upset at the church. When our kids don't come home from youth group and they're totally changed, we get upset at the church. And I can't tell you how many different conversations I've had with upset parents that were upset at me as youth minister because my youth group didn't change their kids. Because coming to my youth group for about an hour a week didn't miraculously change their kids. While the kids were at home, parents were giving their kids anything they wanted. Not talking at all about anything biblical or spiritual, but spending lots of time talking about the success in sports or education, about pouring a lot of time into their academics, or going on vacation, or buying them the newest cell phones or clothes, providing for them the best life they can give them, while not dealing at all with the spiritual aspect of raising their kids. So parents, we have to abandon this idea that it is the church's responsibility to disciple our kids. Parents, it is our responsibility to disciple our kids. It is our responsibility alone to disciple our kids. And so if we want to change the stats, if we want to change that 70% of kids that leave the church, then we need to change how we operate. Parents, we need to take a more active role in this. Now, I have to say, been hard on parents. The church is not necessarily out of blame here either. Historically, the church has elevated its role as well, too high. Without directly saying it, the church has acted as though it's really more important than the family. They don't come out and say that, right? And you get in trouble for saying things like that. But the church has elevated its role in families' life. They act like they are the experts. The church says things like, the church wants to supplement what you're doing at home, which sounds great on the surface, until you actually work out what that looks like. Ultimately, what that's saying is that church is equal to home. And I would say that that's incorrect as well. It looks good, sounds good, but it fails because what happens is we try to create a balance between church and home. And so the church begins to over-program. We create so many things for people to do, and then we guilt people into coming, or guilt them when they don't come. And when they do come, we tend to take families and we split them apart. We send the kids down there, we keep the parents here, and so families are not together at all, and it is counterproductive. And when families miss, they feel guilty for not being there. Orange strategy works to synchronize the family and the church, these two influences in a children's life, ultimately saying what happens at home is more important than what happens at church. What happens at home with the family is more important than what happens at church. We come here, we break bread together, we fellowship, we worship together, and there is value and importance to that. Don't get me wrong. But that is not the most important thing in a child's life. What happens at home, around the dinner table, or before you go put your kids to bed, that is what is most important. What happens outside these walls is more important than what happens inside in discipling our kids. We come here to refill, to be encouraged, to be challenged, and then we go out and we be a light in a dark world, and sometimes that dark world is our children's lives. What happens outside is more important than inside. Partnering to get together means we work hard together. It means we, as the church, give tools to help parents disciple their kids, to pass on faith to their kids. We do everything we can to be another voice in kids' lives that are saying the same things that parents are saying at home. We partner with them, and we see something different because families are making an effort to also disciple their kids, and something magical begins to happen in the lives of families. Children need parents that help them advance in their relationship with God. Parents need a church that helps them be the spiritual leader in their children's lives. This is what Orange is. I know we always hate when we're watching a show to be continued, but this is going to have to be continued next week. Next week, as we continue talking about Orange, we want to talk more practical about what this looks like for us here at North. We've got a team of people that have been working for months now on how this is going to look implementing Orange here at North. And so we want to talk about that. We want to also talk about just some practical principles that Orange has built into everything that it does that drive really what Orange is about. But this morning I want to leave you with this before we end. This is too important of a task to fail. My kids are what is at stake. Your kids, your grandkids are what is at stake here. Church, this is too important of a task to fail. we have to work together, church and family, reflecting the light of Christ in a child's life. Pray with me. Father, I'm humbled right now, I guess, at the responsibility as a parent and also as a minister in a church when it comes to our kids. Father, help us to not brush over this idea of what it looks like to disciple our kids, to train them up in you. Help us to not rush over this. Help us to not blow past this to get on to something more adult. This is so serious of a task, and so much is at stake here. Father, I pray as we continue to work and make plans, both the families and the church, that you would be leading us to what makes the most impact and the greatest impact in the lives of our kids. And Father, help us to feel the weight of how serious this is. Father, we thank you for the opportunity that we get to worship, we get to hear your word, but Father, also thank you for the opportunities that we get to pour our lives into young people. Help us to take that seriously, Father. It's in your Son Jesus' name. Amen.